The next day came with an unexpected rude awakening. Drifting and Shimmering's bodies feeling as if their bones were made of lead and their muscles feeling like the aftermath of a day after a hard workout. They felt as if their hooves were bound to 1,000-pound anvils as they attempted to get up from the ground and figure out how they were going to get out of their new hell. Their hopes of surviving dwindling the more they struggled to even lift a hoof to continue onward. Drifting had managed himself from off the ground first, his limbs aching from the clear dehydration as he attempted to balance himself. Once he'd gotten himself stable enough, he turned to Shimmering and held out his hoof to assist her from off the ground. However, as soon as she moved, she winced at a sudden jolt of pain, having not been caused by the full resting in her body. That worried Drifting, to which he addressed.
"What's wrong, Shimmering?"
It took a moment for her to answer, grunts and other mild exclamations of pain escaping her mouth upon attempting to sit up to a position where she could speak more clearly.
Everything hurts. If I even try to move, I'm attacked with an electrical kind of pain, as if I accidentally touched a live wire.
"You're dehydrated. I need to go back and get our water from the other side of the fence before your condition gets any worse."
Are you crazy? Don't even try to pretend you're not in just as bad shape as me. It's literally written all over your face, and you'd be lucky to even get over the fence in your current state.
She wasn't wrong, but he refused to let her suffer from the same pain he was feeling. Their suffering would only progress to a worse state, so he needed to get the resource they needed most while he still could even walk or stand.
"If I don't try now, I may not be able to even try again. I have enough strength to make 2 jumps, so I must get what we need while I still can."
And if one of those monsters gets you?
"Then if I'm not back in at least an hour, I'll need you to be strong and do all you can to get out of this hellhole. If I don't try now, all of us will die within 2 days or less."
His gaze averted to Shimmering's belly, sending a message to her that it wouldn't just be him and her that would perish, but also the unborn being they both had created together. Shimmering's eyes bulged at the sudden realization that her husband was making her realize, knowing now that she couldn't make any other reason for him to not take a chance to retrieve the thing that would potentially save their lives. She nodded as a way of showing that she understood and accepted that he needed to do this.
Please, be careful.
She requested, to which Drifting nodded and started his way back in the direction of where their luggage had originally been left the day prior. Walking back felt like the equivalent of trying to walk a straight line while drunk and having the flu. His vision slightly dizzy and body aching with each step back towards the supposed front of the dome. Drifting had never drank a drop of alcohol in his life, but he didn't need to know what drunkenness felt like to know that his current demeanor was on par with it. He was shocked by just how weak he'd become in just one night, having been able to clear the fence with ease the day before. It felt abnormal and unlike what the usual symptoms of an onset of heavy dehydration would be like. That, the fact that there were zombie-like ponies wandering around in the woods surrounding him, and that there was once a lively civilization in place of where the massive dome off to his side sat, made him wonder if it was all connected somehow. Nothing was right in this place. Everything was abnormal, bizarre, and mysterious in every possible way. What happened to make all of this come to be? His pondering was interrupted by the sight of his saddlebags coming into view just ahead of him on the opposite side of the fence. Luckily for him, they hadn't been touched or raided by the many monstrosities that were roaming stealthily within the trees, and that caused him to sigh in relief. Now the only challenge that remained was getting over the metallic obstacle, and that wasn't going to be easy in any way. He took a moment to mentally prepare his aching body for the task ahead, knowing he was more than likely being watched by those things. He had to be quick and not waste a single second if he managed to get over the fence, seeing he wouldn't have much of a time window at all. To be sure he wouldn't make a mistake, he paused to remember where the target he was in pursuit of was in the saddlebags. Once he knew where the water bottles were stored away, he turned his gaze back to where his target was resting against the tree, giving himself an imaginary guideline to where he'd have to land, get up, run over to, retrieve the items, run back, and jump back over the obstacle that made his limbs quiver in agony at. As soon as he felt confident that he had a proper route down, he positioned himself far enough from the fence line to where he could gain enough momentum to jump high and fast enough. He gave himself a countdown in his head, bracing every bit of his nerves that were screaming at him to not jump for impact.
3, 2, 1.
With all of the strength he could muster, he started into a fast trot towards the spot that he'd performed the jump, his entire body feeling as if every bone in his body was broken. Upon meeting the spot, he focused all of his strength into his back legs and took the hardest leap of faith he'd ever done, as if his life depended on it. He soared high from the ground and over the metal grating blocking his path, landing on the opposite side with a hard thump and a short barrel roll towards the tree where his target sat still. His body burned and screamed like a banshee upon the hard landing, making him feel as if he were going to vomit. However, he knew he had a job to do, so he shrugged off all of the agony with gritted teeth and groans of the excruciating torture he was enduring. Tears were forming in his tear ducts as he got up from the ground and forced himself over to the saddlebags to retrieve the vital resources that he and his wife desperately needed. He found the water bottles in no time, the practical canisters made of hard and sturdy plastic being exactly where he'd left them. The sound of the inner contents sloshing around erupted upon him grabbing the 3 half-full bottles, making haste with his actions to avoid any confrontation with the zombie ponies within his vicinity. He collected his loot and worked quickly back to the fence, tossing the 3 precious treasures over to avoid dropping them upon his attempt to hop the metal grating once again. However, upon turning to head back far enough to gain momentum upon jumping, he was met with the sight of a pair of bloody red eyes and the smell of rot. Centimeters from his face was the zombified filly, staring him down with murderous intent, to which he could only stay as still as a statue as if he were petrified. His body was in no condition to try and outrun this thing again, and given he'd been the one to piss it off by temporarily blinding it, he was expecting to feel its jagged teeth bite into his muzzle any second. However, after standing still and in a state of unadulterated fear for over 10 seconds, the monster had done nothing. That was even more terrifying, and Drifting didn't dare move or blink. The fact this thing had done nothing but stare straight into his soul was disturbing, and he had no idea if this was a way of it playing with its food or if it was studying him. However, one thing he did know was that Shimmering needed him right now, and he had to do something. Unsure if he was in danger or not, Drifting decided to risk it, slowly beginning to take a step back from the creature. To his relief, the filly did nothing upon him backing away. Therefore, Drifting just kept his pace. He had no idea what was happening, but he didn't care and just kept moving further from the creature. Then something happened that he had not expected to even be possible, and the very action was enough to make every speck of fur on his body stand up straight.
Go, evil. Stay away.
It had spoke, and the words it had said were cryptic and haunting. His blood immediately turned to ice, knowing that the little words the creature had said were a warning. A message that made him feel absolutely sure that his theories about something bad having occurred in the past were absolutely true. Something catastrophic enough to destroy a civilization had been sealed underneath the dome and forgotten, and whatever it had been could turn ponies into hellish monstrosities. While he was questioning why the monster had not attacked him, that wasn't important. He just knew that he needed to get him and Shimmering out of the forest. With no further hesitation, he quickly did his best to get over the fence, grab the bottles, and run like the wind back to Shimmering. As he trotted, he felt no pain due to his fear and adrenaline cloaking every bit of it. He wanted to believe that he was just stuck in a terrible nightmare, still asleep next to Shimmering and awaiting their actual trip to the Blackwood Trail. However, he knew very well that everything he'd seen and experienced over the past 3 days was absolutely real, even if it was hard to believe. Upon approaching where he'd left Shimmering, he saw her in a familiar position he'd seen several times throughout her pregnancy. She was hunched over with one hoof holding back her mane and puking her guts out. Morning sickness. Coming to a halt, he slowly approached his partner. However, before he'd gotten within a distance to where he could reach out and touch her, he suddenly realized something that was strange and unusual. Throughout Shimmering's pregnancy, she'd never gotten morning sickness this often. It usually happened once every other day in the earlier stages, then slowed to maybe once a week within the past 3 months. For her to suddenly have it constantly every single morning after they'd been stranded in the wilderness was odd and awfully inconvenient. He felt a shiver slither throughout his entire body upon realizing this oddity, his mind immediately theorizing that it wasn't the foal resting in her body causing it, but something else entirely. Reluctantly, he reached out and touched her shoulder, hoping that his fears were false.
Shimmering? Are you okay?
Yeah, just morning sickness. Did you manage to get the water bottles?
She answered in a raspy tone, turning her head to meet his gaze. Drifting's heart fell into the pit of his stomach upon seeing her face, her tanned skin now pale and colorless. However, the more haunting sights were the things that proved that his greatest fears had unfortunately turned out to be true. Her eyes were no longer blue, but starting to turn red, and on the ground was a small pool of blood. Not only that, but down from her eyes were crimson smears from tears she'd shed, the droplets at the ends of the trails the same red color. Upon seeing the droplets at the end of the trails, he immediately knew that the tears were not composed of water, nor were they even so. The liquid that had leaked from Shimmering's eyes was blood. A truth that instantly horrified Drifting, knowing that the writing was on the wall. She was slowly adorning the same features as the monsters they'd encountered, and whatever had caused it had been affecting Shimmering ever since the first day they'd stepped a hoof into this forest. In other words, what the filly had warned him about had already completely taken over his wife. He wanted to run, but also wanted to grab Shimmering and take her home. It was like one of those scenes in a zombie movie where you had to make a choice to either kill and free a loved one that was already doomed, or hold on to foolish hope that you could save them.
Honey, what's wrong? You look as if you've seen a ghost.
What could he say? What could he do? He couldn't move or even think straight, knowing he had to do something. Then he suddenly felt a tickle in his throat and felt the urge to cough. He tried to ignore and choke it back down, but without any warning or control, a violent set of coughs began to escape his mouth, each one causing his entire body to erupt in pain and only progressively get worse and worse. It got so bad that tears had started to leak from his eyes, and to his absolute horror, blood had begun to stain the ground beneath him. The tears flooding his tear ducts irritated his eyes, lifting his right hoof up to wipe them clean. But upon seeing his blue fur stained with his life supply, he connected the dots. He was showing the same exact signs as Shimmering, meaning he too was being overtaken by whatever had caused the ceiling of the civilization beneath the structure just off to their side. In other words, he and Shimmering were practically knocking on death's door, unless they somehow managed to get out of this alive. However, the cops continued to attack him with a vengeance and inflict a pain unlike any other. A pain so bad that he couldn't even stand up or control his body. It was the worst agony he'd ever experienced, and while Shimmering had attempted to help him, the hacks refused to stop. His throat was dry and felt as if it were composed of sandpaper, more of his blood splashing onto the ground violently, and his entire body feeling as if it were being crushed slowly. He tried several times to stop himself, but his body didn't relent, and the searing agony attacking every fiber of his body shot him down further to the ground. He coughed and coughed, up until he eventually couldn't keep himself conscious anymore and passed out due to lack of oxygen and the inability to breathe normally. Upon opening his eyes, Drifting was met with absolute darkness and a horrible taste of metal in his mouth. His body felt as if all of his bones were broken, and his throat was sore and scratchy as if he had strep throat. He felt like he'd been through a ringer, and upon seeing who was next to him, everything suddenly came back to him and why he felt so weak and sick. Off to his side was his wife, stiff, pale, and immobile. His heart immediately dropped as he attempted to stand, but was stopped by an agonizing pain that dropped him like a rock. However, his desire to check on her was stronger, and with a strength that he didn't even know he possessed, he dragged his heavy body to Shimmering, hoping that he wasn't too late. One touch to her body was enough of a confirmation, her body being as cold as ice and skin stiff and hard. His stomach churned and nodded upon realizing the tragic truth. His wife, Shimmering Moonlight, was dead along with the son he'd longed so hard to meet in less than 5 days from now. His emotions burst instantly, hoping that he'd feel a kick from his son or feel warmth return to Shimmering's cold corpse. But neither came, and all he could do was cry and beg for some miracle to happen. Nothing happened. The haunting silence of the forest all around him is the only thing that accompanied him in his agony and grief.
Why? Why? All we wanted was a day out. But instead, we end up here. Was one day too much to ask for?
His voice echoed through the trees, wanting only for death to come and take him to be free of whatever hell in Equestria he and Shimmering had ended up in. What had he or his wife done to deserve such a tragic end to their story? They weren't ponies who had done unspeakable things to their own kind, nor were they selfish or greedy. All they had wished for was a happy life together, and in not even a year, their relationship was cut short by whatever they had come down with. Why had it come to this?
We felt the same way when we became what we are now.
A young voice suddenly met his ears just from behind him, to which he turned and saw a sight that he wasn't expecting. It was the filly from before, only she wasn't monstrous, nor looked zombified either. Instead, she appeared like a healthy young pony with fur as white as snow, dark blue eyes, and a short red mane that was no different from any other filly. He had to blink twice to see if he was hallucinating, but each time, he only saw the same thing.
Am I seeing things?
The filly shook her head.
You are seeing what all the victims have seen in their final hours of life. All of us are victims that are trapped here to wander endlessly until the sun eventually burns out.
Victims of what?
Drifting questioned, wanting to get straight to what the filly was trying to convey to him.
The reason why this dome exists and why the forest is without life of any kind. 20 years ago, the darkest day in Equestria occurred without warning, taking the lives of every pony who lived in the town once known as Ponyville.
Equestria's darkest day? What happened here 20 years ago?
The joke cookie epidemic. Joke cookies, a product that used to be sold in joke shops all around Equestria, became the cause of what could have been the end of Equestria. One night, a large batch was sold to the ponies all across the entire town, but the distributors didn't know it contained a deadly airborne virus that is still unknown to this day and spread like wildfire. It was impossible to contain by the time all of the ponies became aware of its presence, hundreds having already been infected and killed. The princess of the town tried her hardest to find a cure or solution to saving Ponyville from extinction, but ended up accidentally creating something that could have spread the virus all throughout Equestria. Luckily, the ponies responsible for sealing of the town managed to kill the creature before it was too late. However, over the years, the seal covering Ponyville began to deteriorate from overgrowth and weather, causing cracks and other openings to form. That factor allowed the virus to seep through and spread throughout this forest and kill everything in its path.
Drifting jumped. The state of the forest and its lack of any life starting to make sense. A virus so deadly that it killed anything, even plant life and other animals, was the cause of the trees being blackened. However, there was one other issue with the filly's story, but it was resolved upon her next statement.
I'm sure you're wondering how we, the abandoned, exist here if the virus kills all it infects. Well, there's another effect to the virus, but only after the victims die. It actually doesn't kill all that it infects. It turns you into what you saw me as before. I found this out only after I eventually met my end to the pain, only to reawaken as a monstrosity lost in this forest.
A chill ran down Drifting's spine. What in the hell was this epidemic? And how could it be so sentient? He didn't want to believe what the filly was telling him, but how could he deny a creature that had been here for an unbearable amount of time? It was clear she was telling the truth, and the fact that not only he, but also Shimmerings and his unborn son would turn into one of the monsters after death was a fate he couldn't imagine living.
So, you're saying that me, my wife, and my son will be trapped here after the virus takes full hold on our bodies?
She nodded.
The only true freedom is if some pony kills us as our rebirthed form. An end that will likely never come to pass.
He couldn't believe it. Fate had served him the coldest dish possible and spat in his face, laughing at his misery. Not only him, but Shimmering and his child that had never had a chance to take its first breath as well. Eternal misery and pain. That was the name of the final chapter to his short-lived life. No happiness, no light, no love. Just agony and eternal torture.
I am truly sorry. I just hope that knowing the truth was enough to give you the closure before you reawaken as one of us.
The filly said as his vision began to darken. She then turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Drifting to fall into the growing abyss that was death. His eyes, now crimson pools of blood with a single black dot in their centers, slowly beginning to turn cloudy. Clouds that, from Drifting's perspective, resembled storm clouds high above him as he continued to sink deeper into the black pit that seemed to have no bottom. Slowly, his limbs became numb, his blood turned cold as ice, and all of his thoughts and memories went dormant to never arise again. Before shutting his eyes, all he could feel was his lungs burning and the beating of his heart starting to fall to a slower pace with each passing second. The drums slowed slower and slower, up until nothing but a haunting still silence met his ears. His eyes creaked shut to deathly slumber. The only thing left before he met death's embrace was the starry sky that was eventually swallowed by the pitch black darkness all around him. Drifting's ears rang loudly as he opened his eyes back to his home of a plastic bubble, now fully aware of what had happened and how he'd gotten to this point. However, the only thing he couldn't understand was how he was alive, just that some force had given him the chance to live long enough to tell the tale.
Mr. Star, are you okay?
A familiar voice spoke from speakers he couldn't see. He still couldn't speak a word, his throat feeling as if he'd swallowed broken glass. So instead, he stuck with his original way of speaking and picked up the notebook and pencil from the ground. It was painful for him to stand, the virus still attacking and destroying his body, but he couldn't falter now. He did his best to scribble his message to whoever was behind the walls all around him, knowing he didn't have much time before whatever they'd given him to temporarily save his life wore off. It took him a minute to write out what he wanted, but he didn't let his aching body stop him, finishing and turning the notebook to the hidden cameras watching him.
I remember everything. I need to speak with whoever sealed Ponyville 20 years ago.
A pause followed, which was expected. It wasn't every day a patient recalls every memory they needed to remember, but his message was clear and very important for the sake of Equestria.
It seems you know more than originally thought, but I must regret to inform you that your request is not something we can fulfill. It's not because we have a reason not to, but because, as I stated before, the one who originally made the comment to build Protective Dome was the leader of the same squad that eliminated subject 129-06782. The only other pony would have any sort of connection to the dome would be Princess Celestia herself.
Once again, he knew how to answer to that, knowing it was important to get the news out that the virus was airborne again. He scribbled his answer down quickly and turned it to the outside of his bubble.
Contact her. It's important.
Another pause came, but the ponies on the other side had clearly caught on to the fact that he was being absolutely serious, the sound of a response meeting the room in a short time.
While there's no guarantee, we will do our best to fulfill your request, Mr. Star. Please allow us some time to perform the proper proceedings. Until we get an answer, we will administer more dose of the substance that we're using to keep the virus within you under control.
Drifting nodded in agreement and understanding, knowing that getting a message to a matriarch wasn't an easy task to meet. However, he had no doubt that his request would get her to comply, seeing it was a factor that could likely cause a slow but sure end to Equestria's existence if it wasn't taken care of. The room was silent for what had felt like forever, the substance keeping him temporarily alive having been administered to him via ventilation and inhalation. He could feel the virus permeating his entire anatomy, eating away at all of his organs. The feeling being similar to the aftermath of when you scrape your knee deep enough to draw blood. His time was limited, and he knew it, but he refused to allow that disease to take any more lives than it already had. An estimated time of 1 hour had passed before the speakers became lively with sound yet again, this time the voice being feminine and somewhat motherly. He'd gotten Princess Celestia's attention, and whether she had chosen to personally teleport to wherever this place was or transmit her replies telegraphically, he didn't care. All he needed was for her to hear the tragic truth of what he'd witnessed in the past 3 days.
Hello, Mr. Star. This is Princess Celestia speaking to you from Canterlot. What is it that you need to speak to me about?
Celestia questioned, clueless that she was about to be met with devastating news that would change her tone instantly. He worked quick to get his message across, being sure to make the conversation as short and sweet as possible. Once he'd finished, he did the same actions as before, aiming his message to the outside of the bubble and allowing the ponies on the other end to relay the message to her.
The virus you contained 20 years ago is no longer sealed from the outside. Over the years, the dome has developed cracks, and any pony who wanders within the area becomes monsters after succumbing to the virus's effects. It killed my wife, unborn son, and eventually will kill me. You need to send a team there to contain it yet again.
There was a long silence after he'd relayed his matriarch the horrid reality of what should have never been brought up ever again. It was understandable, seeing she'd probably assumed that what had killed hundreds had been sealed away forever upon the termination of Rainbow Dash 2 decades prior. It was like a horrible punch to the gut, having been unaware that a small number of her subjects were still being contaminated by that epidemic after 20 years, drifting included. Sorrow filled her voice upon responding back to him.
I see. I never thought I'd hear anything to do with Equestria's darkest day, but I was destined to be forgotten. I am deeply sorry that I failed to keep you and your family safe, my subject. There is no excuse for my failure to assure that virus remains sealed away. I assure you that I will send a team out there as soon as possible to fix the problem, as much as work to contain the areas that the virus has spread to. You have my word as your princess.
He grabbed the notebook and pencil again to write another reply, knowing full well that he had another task to accomplish before he'd perish from the virus. Once he'd written what he needed his ruler to see, he turned it to the cameras again.
Thank you. However, there's another thing I request of you, as a way to keep your team safe, and to give the ponies still wandering around peace at last. Please, kill the contaminated ponies that are in the area. They are victims like me who just want to pass into the other side.
Another pause followed, likely because the princess was taking her time to digest what she was being relayed carefully. It took a minute, but the matriarch came back with a response that was suitable enough for Drifting to die peacefully.
I will alert the ponies on a team to do so as soon as I get one to get the job done, Mr. Star. You do not need to worry anymore.
He nodded, and with that, Celestia came through with one last message before departing to begin preparing to put the joke cookie epidemic to rest for good.
Thank you for bringing this to light, my subject. While I do wish it didn't have to happen this way, you saved Equestria from another crisis that could have become uncontrollable over time. While I wish I could have saved your life in the process. I do hope that your passing is without pain or suffering.
He nodded again as a reply. Then, with no further hesitation, the princess cut the contact and headed off to initiate an operation to seal the openings on the dome. However, it wasn't long before the voice from before erupted from the speakers again, Drifting already knowing what they were going to say.
Well done, Mr. Star. We were sure that operation to seal that virus goes through no matter what after you pass. However, before the virus takes you, do you have any other further requests you'd like to ask us?
While Drifting could just pass away without any further problems on his mind, he did have one last thing that he'd like before he temporarily became one of those monsters. He picked up the notebook and started writing out the last short request he'd like fulfilled before he closed his eyes to a whole new life beyond Equestria. It took little time for him to scribble down, dropping the pencil from between his teeth and turning the notebook to the outside.
If possible, can I see my wife one last time?
No pause followed this time, seeing it was a simple and fitting request. It took seconds before the pony on the other end of the speaker responded back.
Of course. Please allow us some time to collect our body and get suited up to avoid contamination. I'll administer another small dose of the substance to keep you alive long enough. Once again, we thank you for your sacrifice and wish you a peaceful passing.
He nodded, listening as the line was cut from the speakers for the last time. While his body felt as if little insects were eating him alive from the inside, he felt relieved and happy that he'd prevented a potentially massive disaster from destroying Equestria. He could smile confidently in his suffering, knowing he'd done good and could see Shimmering one last time before they met again on the other side. It wasn't long before the door to his room opened, two ponies in hazmat suits rolling something similar to a hospital bed into the enclosure and approaching the bubble with it in tow. Atop the supposed bed was the corpse of Shimmering Moonlight, her body stiff and pale from rigor mortis and looking as if she were asleep peacefully. He nearly lost his emotions at the sight of his beloved, putting his right hoof against the hard plastic wall and just looking at his beautiful wife in eternal slumber. At the position of her left temple, he spotted a wound that looked to have been made by a bullet, probably from when they had to kill her monstrous form after the virus had reawoken her from death. That meant she wasn't suffering like the filly and all those other abandoned ponies were, causing a smile to form on his face and happy tears to leak from his eyes. However, upon one look to her back end, something immediately made him shiver. There was blood, and lots of it, and upon seeing it fully, he knew that there was potentially a much bigger problem now. Where her birth canal was positioned, it had looked like something had forced its way out before she could go into labor and dilate fully, having caused her to bleed massively. The stiffening of rigor mortis made her still appear pregnant, but the blood and amount of damage gave him a sinking feeling that made his blood run cold. What effects did the virus have on unborn foals? He immediately picked up his notebook and pencil and began to write as fast as he could, causing the ponies outside to become worried.
Mr. Star, is everything all right?
One of the ponies asked. Drifting didn't hear him, only continued to try and get his message written out as fast as his current decrepit state would allow him. However, without any sort of warning or chance to stop it, he suddenly felt a tickle in his throat, quickly followed by the urge to cough. He tried to suppress the urge, but as if the virus could read his thoughts, he was taken hold of and began to cough violently once again. However, this time, the amount of blood that came out of his mouth was much more severe, staining the paper and hiding the warning he was trying to tell the two ponies outside the plastic wall before him forever. He dropped the pencil and notebook instantly and fell to the floor, continuing to hack out more alarming amounts of his blood. It only got worse as he began to convulse violently into a seizure, unable to respond or stop himself at all to alert the ponies outside that they needed to check the inside of Shimmering for the foal she'd been carrying. However, his condition only worsened more and more, to the point that the virus had taken a full grasp of his soul and was submitting him into death's embrace. He'd never be able to warn them, and as his breathing became uncontrollable and he began to choke on his own life supply, his body began to turn numb and his eyes cloudy. He shook violently, up until his life force couldn't fight the disease any further, and with a sudden yield of his motions, fell limp on the cold floor. Drifting Star was dead and silenced by the monster feeding on his body, never to speak another word ever again. The ponies outside the bubble were horrified at the sight, but what was even worse was that they didn't even know that their world was now in more danger than before. The one pony who knew the truth was gone, and it was already too late to stop the next generation of the joke cookie virus epidemic. "39 hours earlier. Rainy Forest, an earth pony mare with an attitude as sturdy as a mountain and a spirit for adventuring in the most daring places that nature can offer, was currently traversing a steep trail with nothing but a canteen half full of water, some snacks, her signature cap, and the sweat pouring from her pores. It was a windy evening as she worked her way back to her camp not too far from her current position, making sure to walk with caution and enjoy the sights as she moved. She didn't need a map, having walked these mountains quite a few times, and her cutie mark being a compass and map. She had always had a knack for being able to find her way back to camp without even trying, hence why her practical tattoo was what it was, having no fear of the wilderness. She had her bear spray ready if she encountered any sort of predator, and luckily had never had to use it. Regardless, she still treated every adventure the same way, knowing nature can be unpredictable.
I should be at the camp in about 10 minutes. No doubt this trail has definitely tested my skills. By far the most treacherous and challenging one I've ever faced, but nature still has yet to stump me.
She said as she stopped to take a swig from her canteen and catch her breath. She put her canteen back where it usually rested and started her climb yet again. She started to take a step, up until she heard something that shouldn't even exist in such an environment. Upon the sound of it grazing her ears, she stopped immediately to make sure the wind wasn't playing tricks on her. However, she wasn't mistaken and was absolutely sure she could hear the sound of a foal crying not too far away, to which she immediately was curious.
Why the hell would a foal be out here? This day is just getting more and more interesting.
Listening carefully, she took off as carefully as possible in the direction of the sound, eventually coming to a set of trees that were black as night and the area being dead quiet. A sight that made her feel slightly uneasy, but it didn't matter to her, seeing it was a baby all alone in these woods. She continued walking towards the cries for help up until she eventually found the source, the sight of a supposedly newborn foal with dark blue fur and a mane of dark brown with slight highlights of blonde coloration crying on the ground. She couldn't believe her eyes, but she didn't question it, knowing she needed to help the young one immediately. She reached down and gently lifted the newborn into her arms, its cries dying down rather quickly.
Hey, little one. Where's your mommy, huh?
As expected, the foal didn't speak or give an answer as Rainy cradled it in her hooves.
Looks like I'll have to cut this trip short. Seeing a foal needs more care than I can provide up here. What a trip! Finding a foal stranded in these strange woods.
Having decided the best course of action, Rainy Forest started back to her camp to get ready to head back to civilization, completely unaware that she just made the worst decision of her life.